Good morning. My name is Jim, and I'm originally from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Graduate of the College of William and Mary, and served a couple of years in the U.S. Army as a draftee during the Vietnam period, and fell into museum work there. And I transferred here from Fort Benning, Georgia in 1967. So I've been at the U.S. Naval Academy for 48 years, and that's why I know so much about Annapolis. I've never actually lived downtown. I've always lived out in the countryside, but I've been a member of Historic Annapolis for nearly 50 years. And what's great about the town, and I hope you've had the opportunity during your time here as midshipmen, to walk the streets of Annapolis and see the fantastic architecture and street planning that was done here in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's really a remarkable town. And this morning I'm supposed to tell you about what it was like back in 1812. I wasn't quite here then, but and I've done a couple of handouts for you, and the first one I'm going to read to you. After the Revolution, Annapolis's life of fashion subsided. Its commerce departed. Wealth gradually took its flight from the city, and it fell into a somnolent state. In these days of dreamy slumber, a naval commission supposedly reported that, and I quote, a polar expedition is useless to determine the Earth's axis. Go to Annapolis rather. It should be called the pivot city. It is the center of the universe, for while all the world around it revolves, it remains stationary. One advantage is that you always know where to find it. To get to Annapolis, you have to but cultivate a colossal calmness, and the force of gravity will draw you towards the greater center. Once there is no centrifugal force to displace you, and you stay. By natural evolution, your hands disappear in your breeches pockets, and you assume the most marked characteristic of the indigenous Annapolitan. No glove merchant ever flourished there. Annapolitans in heaven have heads and wings, their hands disappear. An old tombstone, you may see them as angels. On earth they resemble exclamation points, all heads and tails like the fish they eat. Natural evolution develops itself in the taste for oysters, as they need no carving, and a phosphorus diet swells the brain. They talk politics continually. Annapolis keeps the Severn River in its place. This will be useful when the harbor of Baltimore dries up. Annapolitans are waiting for this. They are in no hurry. They don't mind waiting. 2 or 3 centennials will do. This was published in one of the first full-length histories of the city by a guy named L.U. Riley in 1887. And it's repeated very prominently in the newest history by Jane McWilliams, which is excellent, and which a lot of the material that I'm going to speak about this morning is drawn from. Politics, that's what saved the town. The state capital was moved here in 1695 and has been here ever since. Although at this period that you're studying today, there was a number of threats to move it to Baltimore, the new major city in the state. But that didn't happen. The rural interests were very much enjoyed coming to Annapolis by the sea and enjoying the oysters and seafood here. And of course, as the harbor of Baltimore dries up, well, that was the main contention to Annapolis in the first half of the 19th century. In 1790, Baltimore was the 4th-ranked city in population in America. By 1800, it had surpassed Boston and was the 3rd. Even today, it still is, among the top 20 and the 9th most important port, or biggest port in the United States. I think I'll go back and give you a brief resume of how Annapolis came about. In the late 1620s, a guy named George Calvert, who became the first Lord Baltimore, asked his good friend Charles I, King of England, to let him take over the property in the New World in America between what was then the colony in Pennsylvania and the colony in Virginia, established in 1607. George actually dies before that happens, but it does happen in 1632. Charles I awards a proprietary colony in America to George's son Cecil Calvert. And in 1634, a couple little ships named the Ark and the Dove depart England. They have quite a torturous trip, stop in Barbados to resupply, finally get here on March 25th. March 25th is still a holiday in Maryland. It's one of two state holidays known as Maryland Day, because that's the day that these English settlers sent by Lord Baltimore set foot on St. Clement's Island in the Potomac River and established the colony of Maryland. They set up their capital in St. Mary's City. One of the purposes of the county or colony was religious toleration, particularly for Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics were suffering in England because of the Reformation and the Church of England and so forth, and so the Calverts were Catholic, and they wanted an area in the New World where their religion could be practiced without problems. And however, very quickly after the founding of Maryland, the English Civil War broke out. Charles I is actually beheaded, and the Commonwealth comes along under the Cromwells. And this also spread to the New World. Actually, before the settlement got here in 1634, there was a breakaway group from the colony in Jamestown, Virginia, which came north in the bay, basically to trade with the Native Americans, and they established settlements on Kent Island, across the Bay Bridge today from this location, and up at the head of the bay at Head of Elk. They sided with the Parliament, whereas, of course, the Calverts and the colony in St. Mary's were part of the King's folks, because they had been established by Charles I. This went on for a number of years and finally was played out. Actually, it's fascinating. Between the beginning of Baltimore or Maryland in 1634 and our Declaration of Independence in 1776, there were 10 major wars fought, all involving the colonies here to a certain extent. And that's all these wonderful ship models out here in the gallery. We can justify them being here from the fact that those were the ships that were protecting this area, the 13 colonies, during the 17th and 18th centuries, and preserved those colonies for Great Britain. In 1655, we even have, or 1649 first, we have another breakaway group from Jamestown that came up and settled across the Severn River here at Greenberry Point, where those radio towers are, and you're hopefully familiar with Greenberry Point. And it was called New Providence, and there are archaeological remains over there today. That's one of the reasons the Navy has to treat the property with a certain amount of respect and care, because there are some important archaeological sites at Greenberry Point, which was the first English settlement in this area. In 1655, we actually have a little naval battle here in the mouth of the Severn River called the Battle of the Severn, and that was part of the English Civil War between the forces of Parliament and the royalty, the king. And there was only one armed vessel involved called the Golden Lion that the folks at Greenberry Point had managed to commandeer, and then the folks in St. Mary's City sent up an expedition, mainly in small craft, which were forced to land in Eastport on the other side of Spa Creek. And the Roundheads went around the head of Spa Creek and captured Governor Stone and his forces that had come up from St. Mary's. The Virginians helped the proprietors of Maryland, the Calverts, restore peace here in the colony, and the authority of the Calverts in the proprietary colony. In 1695, Maryland gets a new governor, fascinating guy named Francis Nicholson. There's a street here in Annapolis named Francis Street that connects Main Street with State Circle. And in Williamsburg, Virginia, there's a street named Nicholson. Nicholson was a professional royal governor. He had been a lieutenant governor in Massachusetts. After Maryland, being governor in Maryland, he'd be governor of Virginia, actually established Williamsburg, also laid out the city of Williamsburg as well as Annapolis. And then later he was governor of Nova Scotia. Here in Annapolis in 1695, he lays out the town with two circles, Church Circle and State Circle, and all the radiating streets are originally, many of them named after the directions on the compass and so forth. But there's also, of course, King George Street and Prince George Street. King George, of course, he had a succession of King Georges in Great Britain at that time. George, well, first, second, third, fourth. The town was renamed after Princess Anne, who would become Queen Anne. Prince George Street, her husband was George, Prince of Denmark. And we also have Duke of Gloucester and so forth. Annapolis in 1708 was incorporated as a city. One of the few in America recognized by the leadership in England as an incorporated city. Actually, in the 17th century, it's very difficult establishing cities in Maryland because in 1650, the Calverts began awarding a lot of the land in what became Maryland, the state, and they were such large pieces of land that they were awarding. In order to get people to come here, they guaranteed to give you 50 acres of land if you got one for each person that you could attract to the new colony. And so many wealthy individuals that came here established large plantations in the countryside that were pretty self-sustaining. They didn't need a town to support them. They had everything they needed except luxury goods, which they imported from the mother country, from Great Britain. Their primary source of income was tobacco. Almost as immediately as the colony was established here, tobacco became the main resource and income earner and actually was still growing. When I came here 50 years ago, tobacco was still a major crop. And we had these huge auctions over in Upper Marlborough every year for the sale of tobacco. In the real golden age of Annapolis is in the second half of the 18th century. And it's just amazing because 1754, Governor Horatio Sharp, then the appointed governor of Maryland, held a governor's conference here. Actually, the governors of Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Virginia, all came here to meet with a general named Braddock. The colonies were having problems on the frontier with French explorers and adventurers, and this was the lead up to the last colonial wars known here. It started here in America as the French and Indian War, and then spread to Europe as the 7 Years' War. In 1754, Governor Sharp, by the way, he had leased a house that sat where Dahlgren Hall is today, and that would become the governor's mansion for the last two colonial governors of Maryland and for all the governors of the new state of Maryland after our independence until 1866, when it was purchased by the federal government and turned into the library for the U.S. Naval Academy. At that house, he met with the governors and General Braddock, and then they took an overland trip to Alexandria to review the troops that had been landed. The ship carrying the troops had been sent up the Potomac, and of course Braddock took his famous march to the west to what's now Pittsburgh, where he would unfortunately meet his end in a war with the French and Indians. And of course, one of his aides on that trip was a guy named George Washington, a young farmer from Mount Vernon on the Potomac. The thing about the 7 Years' War, it really knocked the heck out of Great Britain financially. They had been fighting a whole series of colonial wars, originally against the Dutch, and then the Spanish and French, and by the 1760s, they're pretty broke, and they're trying to look for all kinds of new resources of funds. And of course, one of those was to tax their colonies. And the first tax, the Stamp Act in 1765, caused quite a row here in Annapolis. It was delivered by a Royal Naval ship, the HMS Hawke. There were some fisticuffs in some of the saloons here, and some prominent Annapolitans ended up in the pokey for beating up on the British, naval officers. It had nothing to do with passing the stamp back, but they had the bold audacity to bring it here. And then in 1774, of course, we have the burning of the tea brig Peggy Stewart down on our waterfront, where Loose Hall is today, probably. There's a historic marker down there. But beginning in the 1750s and 60s, Annapolis started building all kinds of and you can circulate those around, mansions that still stand in the city. One of the wonderful things about Annapolis is the historic preservation movement. And there are at least 12 major mansions and the current State House. The original part of it, anyway, was built at that time. The Maryland Inn at the head of Main Street. It's just amazing, the buildings from that period that have survived. And it was the golden age of Annapolis. There were a lot of important people that were members of the legislature. Many of the houses they built were townhouses for entertaining while the legislature was in session. And because Annapolis was the political capital. So many of the important people that were living here were politicians, lawyers. Law was taught here, of course, by the senior lawyers. It was like an apprentice system back then. But those were the important folks here in Annapolis at that time. And many of them had large plantations in the countryside where they grew tobacco and made a lot of money. I have thrown in a sheet to you with the census figures for Annapolis in 1800, 1810, and 1820, and it's fascinating. As I say, you have this golden age between 1750 and 1800, but almost immediately after the Revolution, Annapolis starts declining. A lot of those young whippersnappers that built these mansions were getting older. Many of them were moving out to their plantations and paying more attention to earning incomes, except during the legislative sessions. And meanwhile, the big houses in Annapolis is where the ladies lived and entertained and helped raise the children. It's interesting about the loss in population between 1800 and 1810. But what's amazing about it is that the big loss was in slaves. And I always thought, when I was first looking into this period years ago, that the slave owners here after the Chesapeake leopard affair in 1807 had moved their slaves out to the plantations. There was a lot of panic here when word reached Annapolis that the British had stopped one of our naval ships off the Capes outside of Chesapeake Bay, and they thought that this war between France and Great Britain had been going on for so many years, the wars of the French Revolution, and then Napoleon, of course, and so they were really scared for their properties, and moved a lot of their, particularly here where naval forces could land, so they moved a lot of their goods out to the plantations. However, it's also known as the economy started failing here, and also the Methodist Church and the Quakers had increased in this area and built new churches and new congregations, and were very much preaching against slavery. And so this caused a number of Marylands to get rid of their slaves and sell them south, and also free them. Annapolis, by the beginning of the American Civil War in 1760, 49% of the black population, African Americans living here in Annapolis, were freemen, because Annapolis, of course, was a border state at the beginning of the Civil War, but there were still some pretty good slave populations, particularly on the eastern shore, and some of the plantations over there. Now, in this period, in 1807, as part of the conflict, and I guess you've all studied naval history, I hope, and know all about the Chesapeake Leopard affair and how the Leopard stopped, fired across the bow of the Chesapeake, and made off, impressed 4 sailors, which eventually led to the War of 1812. And of course did lead to embargoes against British goods. In fact, Maryland even had decided to do that before Jefferson got the Congress to go along with the embargo against Great Britain. Also Alexander Van Horn, who was the local congressman for this district that included Annapolis, began petitioning the Naval Affairs Committees of the Congress to help Annapolis protect itself, and they were establishing what's known as the second, and you're going to have a whole talk about the forts of Chesapeake Bay, the second groups of fortifications in the history of the bay by the federal government. And he was successful in 1807 to convince them to build 2 new forts at Annapolis. There was already a battery at Horn Point over in Eastport, a very small battery, just a couple of guns that had been there since the Revolution. But the Congress voted to establish forts on Windmill Point, which we now know as Trident Point here at the Naval Academy, and across the Severn River, a second fort on what's now, well, just in back of the boat maintenance facility where they maintain the YPs, between there and the firing range. Was Fort Madison, and the one on this side was named Fort Severn. And of course, Fort Severn should be famous to you because it's the original location of the new naval school at Annapolis that was established in 1845. Fort Severn was about 10 acres. It had a house on it that had been built in 1750, one of the the mansions in the Golden Age for Walter Delaney's family. In fact, even after it became part of the Naval Academy, it was still known as the Delaney House. It had served from 1807 to 1845 as the home of the commandant of Fort Severn, usually an Army major. So that was on the property already, and they built a circular fortification for mounting the guns. It was about 100 feet in diameter, and I think 16 feet walls around it. A similar structure, although actually the structure was not similar across the river, and Michelle will tell you a lot more about that. It was more like a star-shaped fort. Those 2 forts never fired a shot in anger. However, they probably kept the British from landing here in the War of 1812. One of the thing that's always fascinating me, years ago, a friend was on the board of the Hammond Harwood House up the street here, asked me to talk about the Navy in Annapolis prior to the U.S. Naval Academy. So I found it was a fascinating study for me anyway, because I had not realized up to that time how many of our early naval heroes set foot in Annapolis, Maryland. It was quite surprising that many of the heroes of the War of 1812 had visited here long before there was ever thought of putting a naval school here. What happened in the early 1800s, probably 1804-5, they established a road between here and the new federal capital in Washington. And as a result of that road, a number of diplomats insisted on being transported in and out of Annapolis rather than go up the Potomac River, which was much more arduous, particularly for a large warship. In that period, the navies of the world carried the diplomatic corps. You didn't have airplanes. And so, for example, in November 1804, General Trudeau, who was the new ambassador of the United States from Napoleon in France, arrived here and traveled overland into Washington. That same November 1804, William Pinckney, who was a native Annapolitan and a very important person in Washington, served in the Congress and had been Attorney General of Maryland, and he entered the diplomatic corps. And Pinckney left from here aboard a naval ship to go overseas and become our ambassadors. He was in Russia, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, and a number of places. And so that made Annapolis a deep water port for our federal government. And in fact, after the War of 1812, they actually tried to establish a naval depot here. There was a committee of the city council that wrote to the Board of Governors of St. John's College, for example, in 1817, asking if the college could give up their land for the purposes of a naval depot. The fathers of St. John's sort of stonewalled it for a couple of years, and finally they wrote back and said, well, we can't find that we have the authority to give the school away. So St. John's didn't become a naval depot. And it's very interesting, a few years later in 1826, St. John's adds military science to its curriculum. And I think this was probably to keep people coming after it again for a naval depot. And certain presidents over there took it more or less seriously after the Civil War. The students at St. John's were actually wearing military uniforms for a few years. And that was about the time that we also introduced the sport of football here. So we used to have a real crosstown rivalry with St. John's College and the Naval Academy, believe it or not. Navy won most of those contests, but one of the early ones, the superintendent jumped into the fisticuffs afterwards, and later Admiral William T. Sampson ended up with a black eye. But anyway, back in the early 19th century, it was remarkable too how many graduates of St. John's College went into the Navy, particularly a number of medical people that went on to medical school and became the highest ranks in our Navy in the medical corps were graduates of St. John's. There were a few others, one who became a professor here at the Naval Academy, and one who became the chief clerk in the Navy Department were graduates of St. John's College in Annapolis. Probably the most notable of the 1812 period was a kid named George Washington Mann, M-A-N-N. He was born over at the corner of Main and Conduit Street in Annapolis. His father ran the City Hotel, and where George Washington stayed a few times, and so that's why he named his son George Washington. His mother was actually the widow of Buckland, a famous architect who built the Hammond Harwood House up here, among others, in Annapolis, and had died young, and man remarried the owner of the City Hotel. And their son went to St. John's College and then into the Navy, and he went across the Atlantic with Preble to help fight the Barbary War against Tripoli. We know he marched across the desert of North Africa with Presley O'Banion, an early hero of our Marine Corps, under Eaton, and they captured the town of Derna, which led to the peace against Tripoli at that time. And he brought home a sword that's on exhibit downstairs that was used by the Marine Corps as the pattern for the Marine Corps officer's sword that they still use today, the famous Mameluke hilt, George Washington Man. But he was home on leave in 1807, just after the Chesapeake Leopard affair. There was a little problem out here in the Chesapeake Bay with some French pirates. There had been a couple of French ships in the bay, one of them needing critical repairs, and a couple of the seamen from them had absconded and taken a boat out of Baltimore. And so Man put a group of locals together in boats and went out to chase, but the pirates had already been taken care of by David Porter, who had taken a group out of Baltimore and taken care of them. I don't know whatever happened to Midshipman Man. He disappears, but in 1979, one of his descendants walked into the front door of this museum and gave us one of his uniforms, a uniform jacket and that sword. And it's just amazing. That jacket's on display downstairs, too. It's one of the oldest surviving pieces of American naval uniforms. And it's lightweight muslin material that he probably wore through the desert of North Africa in 1805 during the attack on Derna. In 1809, let's see, I have some, this guy comes to town, Stephen Decatur, in the USS United States. For provisions, he's sort of on test trials for the ship that had been refitted at that time. He's not here to pick up any diplomats. He's just put in probably for fresh water and so forth. And of course, during the War of 1812, on the 25th of October, he captures the HMS Macedonian, whose figurehead is down the street on exhibit, or a copy of it now. The original's up in our attic. In 1811, this guy was here, Isaac Hull, with the frigate Constitution. And he's provisioning the ship and also boarding a guy named Joel Barlow, who is going to be our new ambassador to France. And Hull is having quite a time with Barlow, because Barlow has this large entourage he's taking with him, including his mother-in-law. Mr. Hull, Isaac Hull, is having quite a time in Annapolis. There's a wonderful letter in his biography about the women of Annapolis and how he was being entertained by some of the younger women, but also some of the grand dames of town, including the wife of the governor, Lloyd, in the Chase Lloyd house and so forth. They finally depart and go over to France, and then after Hull comes back, and he is here in June of 1812, when on the 18th of that month, the U.S. Congress, for the first time in its history, declares war on Great Britain. Hull immediately starts provisioning his ship, and he gets orders from Washington to go join Commodore Rogers off in New York, and departs on the 4th, fires a salute to the Union on the 4th of July, and heads down the bay. On board with him at that time was a young local fellow named John Conte, who he had recruited. He was now a second lieutenant in our Marine Corps. And Conte would be on board the Constitution through the rest of 1812, and would return here after his service And with the prize money he earns off of being aboard Constitution in 2 of its famous battles, he buys property down in South County, just south of Annapolis, which he names Java Farm, after the HMS Java, which Constitution eliminated on the 29th of December, 1812. But Constitution, when it left here, that's the famous cruise where it went up the coast and off of New Jersey. The wind died, and wouldn't you know, a British squadron would come over the horizon, and Hull got guys out in the boats to pull it, and of course the British started the same thing. And then downstairs you'll see a famous, what's called a sea anchor. It was like a giant umbrella that they hauled out in front of the ship, and put in the water with a rope attached, and after 92 hours of very strenuous labor, Constitution was successful in escaping the British squadron, so that a month later, on the 19th of August, up in the North Atlantic, it runs into one of the ships of that squadron, the HMS Guerriere, and we have that famous battle in which Constitution earned its nickname Old Ironsides. But that cruise actually left from here, Annapolis, Maryland, at that time. Also in Annapolis at the beginning of the War of 1812 was the USS President, under command of this guy, John Rogers, who enjoyed being able to anchor at Annapolis because he was originally from Havre de Grace up at the head of Chesapeake Bay, and he was visiting family when orders arrived to him to go protect the water approaches to New York. And in 1811, he leaves here and fights what some historians consider the first battle, naval battle of the War of 1812, the President and Little Belt. As I say, I've always been impressed by the fact that these guys were actually here at Annapolis. Now, when the war broke out, of course, the principal defenses, as I've mentioned, were Fort Severn and Fort Madison. But they were having a difficult time manning those forts. Of course, there was a certain draw by the federal government for Annapolis area men to join the service and help protect the country, particularly up along the Canadian border, where all the land battles of this war were fought in the early days of it. So they were having problems in maintaining. Also, I think that there was also a problem with diseases here at that time. Particularly smallpox was one of the worst, but you also had typhoid, malaria, and I think this could have been affecting some of the troops that were manning Fort Severn and Fort Madison. In the summer of 1813, of course, the British had sent a naval force. They had almost immediately after the war was declared blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, and they sent naval force up the bay under Admirals Warren and Coburn. Luckily, they set up a base on Tangier Island, which they maintained throughout the war. And then they made this amazing dash up the bay, past Annapolis, scared everybody here in town when they saw this naval force under Coburn going up. And they did attack the head of Elk and Havre de Grace. They went up the Sassafras River, attacking Georgetown and Fredericktown, and then eventually came down and made a landing in Kent Island, attacking St. Michael's on the eastern shore. A lot of cute stories, which I'm sure other speakers in this series will tell you about, how the folks at St. Michael's hung lanterns in the trees at night to keep the British firing in the wrong directions. All in a summer's work, Coburn had made living here in Chesapeake Bay pretty miserable for the local residents, and many of them had fled inland to their plantations here in the Annapolis area. And although they thought that the forts were protecting them, there are reports that British ships, particularly the Menelaus, came in and actually sent a landing party ashore and under the cover of darkness. that supposedly walked all over Fort Madison, for example, and realized that, hey, these guys aren't doing a great job in manning these forts. However, one would think that if the British started firing, I'm sure that they would be manned very quickly. But in the summer of 1813, they were having problems, and so this guy, Charles Morse, who was a great hero already in the Navy of the battle, he was the equivalent of the executive officer of the frigate Constitution in the battle with Guerriere. He had been wounded in that battle, but he was a great hero of that battle, and was advanced in rank, much to the objection of some of his fellow naval officers, for his role in that battle. And he was at that time over in Washington. They were building a new ship called the Adams, USS Adams. And he and his crew were sent over here to Annapolis and manned Fort Severn in August, early September of 1813. However, not long after that, the British left the bay, or the main forces anyway. They always went to the Caribbean for the winter. Reminds me of Zeke Hopkins and what he did after he got control of the Continental Navy in 1776 and went off to Bermuda. But anyway, and the Bahamas. So and also his sailors off the Adams were getting sick with fevers, probably malaria, and so they returned to Washington and let the locals. Meanwhile, during the winter of 1813-14, Joshua Barney, who was an amazing character, he was a native of Baltimore, Maryland, fought in our Revolution and then our War of 1812, first as a commander of a privateer named the Rossi. But he is also, I call him the American Lafayette, because in between the Revolution and the War of 1812, Mr. Barney went off to France and actually got a commission and served in the French Navy. We have a wonderful letter. It's still on exhibit out here for a few more weeks anyway, in which Lafayette writes to Barney offering him any assistance he can give him. Barney was then in Paris. Barney got disenchanted with Napoleon and came home. But in the War of 1812, after his command of the Rossi, he came back to the Baltimore area, and the Navy Department talked to him into helping out with the British in the Chesapeake Bay. And in the winter of 1813-14, he put a flotilla together up in Baltimore, which he came down here to Annapolis to provision, or at least some of the crafts were in and out of Annapolis being provisioned. We did have things like rope walks here and sail makers, and we had helped a great deal in the Annapolis area with the Maryland State Navy during the American Revolution. However, when he sails down the bay in the spring, the British had come back from the Bahamas or the West Indies, and Barney's flotilla was no match for the ships of the Royal Navy. And you're going to be really deep into that, those events and how they chased him up the Patuxent River and St. Leonard's Creek and so forth. The British also had with them at that time a new Admiral Cochrane and 4,500 hardened troops that had served in the British Army in the Spain primarily, and they were hungry for action. And there was a meeting between Cochrane, Coburn, and Ross, General Ross, the commander of the British Army, and they decided to land their troops at Benedict on the Patuxent River for the march on the federal capital in Washington. Okay. Whoa. Well, anyway, you're all going to get deep into that. Let me just tell you that right at towards the end of the war, of course, the British, 1814, Napoleon goes into exile for 100 days. That frees up some of the British troops, of course, that were sent here for this action against Washington. And they actually planned 3 invasions of America. One north that was stopped by McDonough at the Battle of Plattsburgh, or Lake Champlain in September of 1814. Fort McHenry, of course, and then what became the Battle of New Orleans, the largest battle of the war that was fought after it. Late in the war, this guy, Oliver Hazard Perry, was assigned to superintend the building of a new ship at Baltimore called the USS Java. He came to Annapolis when the Java was finished. Now, this happens just after the war. So Annapolis is actually, although it's on a decline financially, the war and actually the Navy is helping it earn some income. And right after the war, Perry's here. Chauncey, they build a new ship of the line up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it comes down here in 1816. The President and Mrs. Madison and members of the cabinet and senior naval and marine officers come over here and visit. A young midshipman, in this picture says he's an admiral, of course, not in that picture, named Franklin Buchanan, a native of Baltimore, is aboard. He was, of course, later became the first superintendent of the Naval Academy. And then this ship, the Franklin, comes under Stewart right after the war. And aboard that is a young midshipman named Farragut. And it's interesting because once they get to the Med, Buchanan is reassigned, and they have both Buchanan and Farragut, who were, of course, the 2 senior officers opposing each other in the famous Battle of Mobile Bay on the same ship. Well, of course, what helped, as I say, Annapolis probably benefited more from the war than it being affected, since there was no landing here. There were a number of guys from Annapolis. The State House was used as a lookout for that fleet when it went up the bay in 1813, and again in September of 1814. There were a lot of people that were scared here, again moving stuff out to their plantations. Any questions? I'm sorry for running on so long, but
yeah, and actually some of the photos that he has had, it's okay. Some of the photos that he presented to you are actually here in the museum, especially on the second deck. There's some here on the...
Oh, the original portraits.
Yeah, the original portraits. And the one by Stewart that he pointed out, that was my first book, was on Commodore Stewart. That's black and white, but you can see the full-length color one that's about 10 feet tall in the National Gallery of Art. It's spectacular. So thank you very much, Jim.
Yeah, okay.
Appreciate it. All right.